Hi, everyone who's watching us. I'm Anna Engelhardt, and today with me is Emily Rosamond.
Hello.
We're in the space of the Green Room exhibition, which is the two artists exhibition by me, Anna Engelhardt, and another artist, Bahar Nourizadeh. The exhibition is dedicated to the politics of platforms and how we can think about digital space as a continuation of offline space and the power relations that are embedded in it. And we are hosting today a public talk, a public interview with Emily. Today, with Emily, we're going to talk about her upcoming book, Reputation Warfare. And the talk in general is going to be structured as I'm going to give an introduction, and then I'm going to ask a couple of questions to introduce the vocabulary for the conversation, and then we're going to switch to more speculative side to allow some more like conceptual thinking to appear. So I wanted to briefly introduce Emily. Emily Rosamond is a writer, artist, and lecturer in visual cultures at Goldsmith, University of London, where she serves as department chair of learning and teaching. Her research considers how social media platforms and financial apparatuses foreground reputation and character as speculative logics of network personhood. Her recent publications have appeared in Theory, Culture, and Society, Journal of Cultural Economy, and the Journal of Aesthetics and Culture, among others. She is an associate editor of the academic journal Finance and Society. Her forthcoming monograph, Reputation Warfare, explores volatility in online ranking and ratings. So, to come to the first question, I would assume for our viewers, the term reputation capital would actually ring a bell. The more normalized such words as reputation capital are in our everyday vocabulary, the more it is important to defamiliarize them. See how they gained their meaning, how such meaning changed over time, how we ended up all know terms because not all scientific terms end up in the everyday speech. So, would you mind giving an introduction to this term, explaining its relevance, especially for social media today? And maybe think against how we can distinguish reputation capital from like other terms. Yeah, so yeah.
Great. Well, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I've really enjoyed seeing this exhibition, and of course, there's a little bit of it in the background of the shot. And yeah, and thank you to everyone out there, hello, who's joining us remotely. Um, so yeah, the term reputation capital is one that is definitely around. It probably has a bit of an air of familiarity, and especially given that social media and online platforms are really quite often foregrounding reputation measures of various sorts, and they can be, in fact, quite heterogeneous in nature. So, a lot of different kinds of counters, for example, on many social media platforms could be part of giving a sense of what someone's reputation might be like. For example, friend counts on Facebook, like and share counts, and that sort of thing. But also very hidden kinds of measures, such as the formerly used Facebook algorithm called EdgeRank, which was used up until 2011. And that one would be analyzing the relationship between objects and edges. So, in other words, trying to sort of analyze your the strength of your interactions with other Facebook users in order to sort news feeds and things like that. So there are all kinds of kind of behind the scenes measures that might also, in complex ways, reflect something like reputation. The term reputation capital has a number of different uses, and it's used with some frequency in contexts such as management studies, for example. Obviously, in discussions of how to manage a corporate brand, reputation is an important thing, and it is often seen roughly speaking, as an intangible asset. So, for example, a company might have a reputation for dealing with customers well, or it might have good sort of value in its brand. These might be aspects of its reputation as an intangible asset, and so it's kind of it is used with some frequency in discussions around management studies and things, not always so precisely defined, but certainly prevalent. And one of the things that really interests me is that it seems to me that the use of reputation capital within kind of business and management contexts has actually oh, has
Yes.
actually kind of
Yeah, yeah.
moved between a kind of corporate context and then also a personal context. So, in fact, a certain language of reputation capital has actually kind of migrated, if you like, from the sort of management context to personal context. So, one example of this is the reputation.com founder Michael Furtick, who founded the business reputation.com, which was designed to help businesses manage their reputations and to sort of offer design solutions around problems that different companies might have with their corporate reputation. For example, the fact that sometimes people would be more likely um, to post a negative review if they were angry about having bad service from a company, and they might be much less motivated to do that if they felt that everything was fine. So he comes up with ways to design around that. For example, having a quick and easy button that's available right at the counter if you're going into a shop or something, so you can say, "How was the service?" "Oh yeah, it was fine," and then that kind of removes that barrier, that sense of a boundary, to getting those good reviews. But Michael Furtick also wrote a book for people, for not just companies to manage their brand, but actually for online users to do the same thing. And so he is thinking about ways to curate your digital presence such that your LinkedIn profile might rise to the top of prospective employers' interests, what kind of things you can do to your online reputation to get preferential treatment or interest rates in various ways. And interestingly, what to do if there's any bad information out there about you on the internet. So he talks about ways to provide digital smoke screens to kind of not get rid of things that are out there necessarily, but sort of camouflage them, kind of derank them, make them appear a bit lower on search results. So there's a shift from this sort of corporate context in which reputation capital has been used into a more personal way in which reputation capital is being used as an idea. And of course, that is coming into conjunction with all kinds of really complex histories of reputation tactics and reputation management that, of course, has been going on in people's private and personal lives for many centuries. So it's sort of nothing new, but kind of newly inflected, if you like. So this brings us back to questions of how to situate the term reputation capital in relation to other similar and related terms. One, and I'm going to talk about two different ways that the term might be contextualized, although there are many others. One that comes up a lot is Pierre Bourdieu's idea of social capital. So there are definitely several people who have theorized online reputation capital as a form of social capital, or even called it digital social capital, for example. And I do not take that approach so much, but it certainly is out there. And of course, this is an idea basically coming from Bourdieu that understands reputation online as an extension of the Bourdieuian idea that that so it's basically social capital. So in other words, the kind of sense of possible or actual, tangible or intangible sort of assets or benefits or resources that might accrue to one via their social network, via belonging to a particular group. Um, I happen to think that the term symbolic capital from Bourdieu is a better fit to talk about reputation than social capital is, although that does go against what some other people have said about how Bourdieuian ideas of capital relate to reputation capital. And symbolic capital for Bourdieu is not capital as such, but an effect of capital. In other words, what happens when another form of capital is kind of transformed into symbols that can then be read by those who have the tools to see it as legible in a particular way. And of course, when I think about the prevalence of like measures on a social media platform, for example, that idea of something that becomes that becomes sort of self-referential in the world of signs. The signs sort of accrue value into themselves and start acting almost a little bit separately from, for example, the actual social network to which they ostensibly refer. That kind of interests me more, I think, than taking the social capital line directly. However, there's another possible framing that is more relevant to the work that I've been doing, and that is to think about the relationships between reputation capital and human capital. So human capital theory, broadly speaking, is a kind of thought that was particularly developed in the 1960s by Gary Becker and Theodore Schultz, among others, although there are precedents, quite a bit earlier than those two thinkers. And it's basically a way of thinking of how, for example, one's skill set, one's abilities have value to oneself, obviously, insofar as one could make a living, but also maybe to others, one's family, even one's nation, one's state. And so Becker and Schultz became kind of very key thinkers in a number of debates on neoliberalism, as I'm sure will be familiar to you and to a lot of people out there. And this is especially through Foucault's work on neoliberal subjects and neoliberal governmentality in his Birth of Biopolitics lectures. So for Foucault, the idea of human capital becomes a kind of a basis for an entrepreneurial subject within neoliberalism. And a lot of thinkers that I have been very influenced by and kind of engaged with their work quite a lot have sort of taken this sort of thinking and extended it in different ways. For example, Michel Fer, the Belgian philosopher who has written very interestingly on neoliberalism, talks about how basically since Foucault's lectures on neoliberalism, there has been a massive expansion of the credit market, and so neoliberalism isn't so much about profit as Foucault might have imagined, or indeed as the early neoliberal sort of thinkers might have imagined, and therefore it comes to relate to the idea of credit much more. And in fact, Fair argues that the aspirations of human capital expand in financialized neoliberalism. In other words, in a neoliberalism where the financialization of the economy is in full on full display. So through the expansion of credit, through the expansion of derivatives, and all kinds of investing practices. He argues that human capital becomes a category that doesn't only refer anymore to just, for example, how much benefit getting a college degree might have to somebody's lifetime earnings, for example, the kind of things that the 1960s human capital theorists were really interested in. But instead, human capital could be really kind of anything. It could be personal traits that might allow one to get a date. It might be going to the gym or not, smoking or not, also education, but also social networks, all kinds of different things. And that, in fact, neoliberal subjects become something like portfolio managers of their human capital. Um, so this is sort of something that I'm in close sort of dialogue with in my own work, and one of the ways that I'm interested in situating reputation capital is to think of it as a kind of derivative form of human capital. And so, what on earth does that mean? So, basically, a derivative, of course, is something that is derived from something else, right? In the simplest possible way. It is, within finance, a derivative asset is something that is derived from an underlying asset without that underlying asset necessarily needing to be traded in order for that derivative to be an asset. For example, I could purchase an option, the right, but not the obligation to, sell a stock, let's say, at a particular time for a particular price, right? So that's kind of based on an underlying asset of some sort, but it's not the underlying asset. I don't have to trade it. I'm sort of trading around it. I'm trading based on something that was derived from it. So there's this sort of there's this way in which derivatives in finance kind of act as at a remove from whatever is being traded, and then I'm kind of arguing that social media platforms sort of do the same thing with reputation in a way. So let's say an online user, in a really sort of simple example, gets a whole lot of likes for a particular Facebook post or something like that. The likes might signify something about their reputation, but they're not the reputation itself. They're a sign of the reputation, and they're sort of derived from the reputation, but also kind of infrastructuralized by the platform as well. So of course, they can only be tabulated because of how the platform is set up in a particular way. But then they can kind of take on a life of their own because they've become kind of unlinked from the person in a way. So in a weird way, I mean, reputation I've kind of talked about previously as something like the network extensivity of the subject, like how an idea of the subject, almost like something that turns a subject inside out. Like that's how ideas of a subject circulate within a social network or a social group in some way. So reputation as a concept has always been a little bit at a remove from the person whose reputation it is. And so somehow with online platforms and with this sort of concretization and mass mobilization of reputational signs and measures, I'm arguing that sort of distinction, that separation between the self and the reputation it kind of acts like a derivative, like a derivative from an underlying asset. And it's all about, like, my whole interest really is kind of what happens in that distance between the quote unquote underlying asset, whatever is seen as valuable in a person, and the measures that kind of acquire a life of their own and kind of their own set of dynamics.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer.
No. It was actually amazing. So like, just to like sum up, we as like all users have a reputation, right, as an asset, and then it gets quantified by the platform, right, in the terms of likes and like other metrics.
Yeah.
So we have like this untangible thing that then can be like quantified as likes or like visualize something else, but we have it like as like, I don't know, like I am a blogger and I'm known as X, so as an X I would have this thing potentially. And before, like reputation capital that you're talking about, it was an external network that was not ascribed as like someone would own it. It would be like the intangible connections between the people.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I think this is something I think really important that you're getting to here. So of course, one of the rationales, let's say, that one of the reasons why social media platforms use reputation metrics. I mean, there are many, but one of them might be because they're kind of addictive. So I'm sure we can all think of examples of hearing people or even feeling this ourselves going like, oh, I'm so glad I got this many likes on my post, or that my post went viral, or whatever, or I was disappointed because like nobody cares what I post. All of these kinds of things. There's definitely a kind of almost like a behaviorist bent to certain aspects of why reputation measures are there on a platform, because they are, people like to be liked, and and then when there's this sort of language of liking that becomes prevalent, it's very it becomes very sort of tantalizing in a way to engage with that and to be rewarded. And of course, the promise of that, in part, is that my reputation will be legible. My reputation will be, it will exist in this platform. But one of the things that I think is very interesting is, of course, any online user's reputation, whether that's in a blog or on Reddit or on Facebook or whatever, it's obviously not only valuable to them. So it's valuable to the platform, obviously, to kind of collect reputations. I tend to think about certain platforms as almost securitizing reputation. So in finance, securitization refers to the practice of kind of bundling together assets such that they can then be made into interest-bearing sort of bundles, if you like. And in a similar way, if you think of a platform like maybe say Airbnb, for example, they obviously, have a lot at stake in their rating system working for everyone. The hosts and also the renters of various flats through Airbnb are also trying to presumably get the highest ratings so that they can charge more or be granted access to more nice properties and things like that. From Airbnb's perspective, I think of it almost like they're securitizing reputations. It's not that they're totally like, if let's say one time somebody has a terrible experience on Airbnb, as of course there are plenty of stories of that, or one renter is awful and trashes a place. These are problems for Airbnb, but not big problems, because it's sort of invested in all of the reputations. It's almost like securitizing the reputations. It might lose on a few reputations that are bad or that go bad or that are unreliable, but as long as the whole thing kind of works, it's fine. And so I think that, so there's a way in which when we use platforms, we might enter into value systems for platforms, but also kind of within social networks, right? So if somebody's associated with somebody who becomes a big YouTube star or something, that might have residual benefits for their online presence as well. So there's a kind of very complex way in which reputation capital is not only the property of users. It's, of course, the property of platforms who I would say securitize reputations. But it's also there's also an invitation for everyone to kind of almost invest in other people's reputations. So, in a sense that maybe, I think of online reputation as something that almost seems to have its own weather patterns in a way. People can talk very easily about how it shifts, like the sort of broad patterns by which it shifts over time, when maybe someone becomes famous on a particular platform and another person gets canceled or whatever, and there's a sense in which one can kind of, by liking a particular other personality, for instance, one might find oneself sort of rising with the tide if their reputational fortunes increase, or conversely going down if a close friend has a sort of personal PR disaster, if you like. So yeah, it's definitely by being derivative, it is also online reputation is something that is very open to being invested by a lot of other people. Sorry, that was again like really long-winded answer.
So like I think it's very important what you're saying about securitization because
Yeah.
so we have been talking about reputation capital, but then the crucial part of your book is reputation volatility.
Yeah.
So securitization also welcomes the shadow part of the situation.
Mhm.
So can you please explain the new shift to reputation volatility? And also importantly, what's the difference between volatility and instability?
Yeah, really good question. So first of all, maybe just a few introductory remarks about the term volatility itself. So of course, and this is a term that I find myself increasingly drawn to, particularly just thinking about the many ways in which this moment is a volatile moment. I mean, socially, politically, climatologically, etc. So, of course, there's a more general definition of what volatility is, the more sort of familiar one, probably for most people, which has to do with, of course, changeability and maybe instability, a kind of a sense of the opposite of calmness, maybe highly volatile conditions, volatile weather conditions, financial conditions, etc. Within the world of finance, there's also a slightly more technical sense in which volatility refers to something that's very different from uncertainty. So it's quite often differentiated from uncertainty. So whereas uncertainty might be something that completely can't be predicted. Something that's absolutely not on anybody's radar. Volatility is more like the measurable distribution of changeability over time. And so one way to think about this might be, I'm sure we're all probably familiar with looking at like financial market graphs, and of course we're very this sort of squiggly line of the financial market sort of fluctuations over time gives us a sense of like the kind of measurable, the idea that markets are sort of always going up and down, always fluctuating. And they are the kind of range of how well and not well they do is sort of like the measurable volatility of the market. Or you could think about a particular asset that might have a certain level of like sort of peaks and troughs over time, and that would be kind of a measurable distribution of different values. So volatility in that sense has a very different connotation to uncertainty, which is at least in theory, sort of not charted at all, or not measurable in some way. And so I'm picking up on the term volatility a lot, partly following a prompt from Benjamin Lee, amongst other writers who in the co-edited book that he wrote, or edited rather, and wrote some of, with the late Randy Martin, called Derivatives and the Wealth of Societies. Benjamin Lee argues for kind of more cultural studies and sort of art approaches to the problem of volatility, given how important financial volatility is, and to really and for more work within art and culture that tries to think about the differences between uncertainty and volatility as something that's kind of measurable. And I think one of the things that I think becomes incredibly clear in online platforms is that they, in some cases, we could say they might heighten the uncertainty of reputation. So, of course, it's possible for people's reputations to increase or decrease for all kinds of different reasons, and that's been the case, maybe as long as reputation has been around. I don't know. But certainly, like within online platforms, it might be possible to have a storm erupt around one's reputation. And I have examples in my book, for instance, about particular individuals who have been extremely Twitter shamed, for instance, where suddenly, they might have had a very, very quiet profile on Twitter with not that many followers and just saying a few things. One of their tweets goes viral and is shamed, and suddenly they're the number one worldwide trend on Twitter, and they've lost their job, and their whole life kind of falls apart for a while. So we could say, from that user's perspective of being very heavily shamed and having that shame kind of amplified on a platform like Twitter, we could say that that's from the user's perspective, that's like a total uncertainty. How on earth would they have thought that would have happened? Maybe that's becoming less unknown to people now that the pattern is becoming familiar, but certainly in, I would say, like kind of the early 2010s, these sort of mass online shaming events were a little bit more surprising, perhaps to people. So there's a sense of total uncertainty, that you could go from being just, really having a very small social network to being the number one most shamed person in the universe or something. That kind of, it makes sense to talk about that in terms of uncertainty, especially from the user's perspective. But the platform itself might be translating that uncertainty into volatility. In other words, an idea of a measurable distribution of adulation or shame, a kind of a sense of a trackable change in reputation that unfolds over time and that is measurable. So, for example, you could do a kind of a graph, like the Topsy graphs, for example, that would show the use of a particular person's name on Twitter, who has been, very shamed, and you can see the sort of like nothing, massive spike. And then slowly it comes down. And it's that sort of, and there are all kinds of platforms that make us very familiar with thinking about reputation in those terms, thinking in like something that's almost like a market diagram of, fluctuations of stock prices over time, starts to be a kind of a familiar form that sort of shifts into personal reputations as well. And of course, there are other platforms that do that. For example, platforms that allow you to see your quote unquote analytics, right? So, for example, like many academics, I'm on academia.edu, and it gives you the option to click on analytics, and then you can see this chart of how many people looked at your work over time. And so it's totally a kind of automated diagramming of changeability and a kind of a marking of the bounds of changeability for people's personal or indeed professional reputations that comes to be kind of really central, I think, to the logic of how reputation works.
Yeah, I think I know a lot of examples of this actually in Russian cyber warfare, because I
Interesting.
think Russian propaganda has been obsessed with likes and reputation for a very long time.
Yeah.
So they have a lot of professional software solutions that quantify exactly the fluctuations you're talking about.
Interesting.
So introducing the warfare situation in the conversation, I wanted to ask you, because what reputation volatility allows for, right, is reputation warfare.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you to elaborate more on the term. So the difference between reputation warfare and reputation volatility,
Yeah.
etc. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. And so basically, I kind of argue that in the early 2010s, let's say, there was a kind of predominant narrative about why reputation measures were out there in all kinds of different platforms, and particularly, although not exclusively, in e-commerce and so-called sharing economy platforms. And that was to facilitate trust. So you had sort of tech enthusiasts and writers such as Rachel Botsman, for instance, who were writing about how great it was that through online platforms you could have a kind of distributed form of trust, as everyone, can kind of see how people have behaved. Have they paid people back? Have they been a reliable guest? All of these sorts of things. And the idea of this seemed to be, at the time, at least in part, that this would create trustworthy online environments, and it would facilitate trust between people who might not know each other in advance. Of course, there are a lot of other things going on in reputation. For example, an idea of kind of competition over status, for instance, is a big part of, like the logic of Facebook, for instance, kind of seeing how popular people might be instantly, and being able to read that sort of these sort of indexes of hierarchy. And what I'm sort of arguing is that there's a shift away from, at least in many contexts, not necessarily all. There's a sort of shift away from what I'm calling the reputation capital paradigm of reputation. In other words, the idea that that this is what reputation does, that it will facilitate trust. Now, this is not to say that an idea of reputation online as facilitating trust doesn't exist. Of course it does. And probably many of us have had, moments where we might read reviews before buying something online, or, things like this. People do kind of look for trustworthiness in this way. But one of the things that I'm sort of arguing is that because reputation is a derivative form of human capital, and also a performative form of human capital. So I'm arguing that human capital kind of becomes performative as well as derivative through online reputation measures. In other words, it is purporting to be kind of democratic in a way. So any online user, could add their star rating out of 5 for a product, or like a post or not like it, and this would somehow capture the general public sentiment. And so that there's that sort of idea, but of course it's not, like, in a way that that's sort of the prevalence of measures is actually, I would say, foregrounding the volatility of measures more in many cases than their ability to create and facilitate trust. And so there's a sense in which, for example, we could think about vote brigading, for instance. So an idea that a lot of social media platforms kind of facilitate, whether by design or by accident, really, a kind of a sort of brigading of votes, a sort of idea that, like, one can kind of coordinate the votes and actively make sort of perform a reputation into being, make something highly reputable or highly disreputable. And so there's a kind of very performative dimension, and I think of sort of very widely sort of publicized, if not always sort of clearly analyzed, events such as Gamergate, for example, as really clear examples of this, where you have, in this case, a very quite misogynistic sort of deployment of trashing as a kind of performative mechanism, as a kind of performative intervention into people's human capital. such that somebody's reputation can be trashed. And of course, this is something that is playing out through a kind of vote brigading, through a kind of like a weaponized use of social media and social media measures. But it's also very, very complex in terms of what's going on, because in order to understand it, we need to think about, in this case, domestic abuse, which was part of the sort of motivation for Gamergate, misogyny, racism, heteronormativity, et cetera, which are also kind of part of the mix, but somehow get translated into reputational terms. And so there's a sense in which the act of trashing a reputation can seem very simple, because it might relate to how a particular set of measures looks on a platform, but of course it's discursively incredibly complex to unpack what's going on there. And now we get to more what I guess relates to your research on cyber warfare, which is the very active kind of militarization of likes and social media metrics. And certainly you know a lot more about the Russian context than I do. But yeah, there's certainly a lot of governments kind of thinking in these sorts of terms, and in various places, deliberately trying to weaponize the appearance of likability on social media, the appearance of popularity. One example that comes to mind for me is the Israeli Act.il app, which is designed to allow people interested in garnering the reputation of Israel online to complete social media missions. And so, for example, it might be things like posting nice things on a foreign celebrity's wall when they decide to visit Israel. Or it might be questioning a sort of pro-Palestinian voice, on a particular platform. So all kinds of kind of coordinated, app coordinated interventions into the value of online reputation, which are precisely taking advantage of the fact that reputation is, we could say, derivative human capital and performative human capital, that one can like it into being. To like something is to make it appear as likable, and therefore to give it reputation. And so I'm very interested in the fact that it's the derivative condition of online reputation that allows for what I refer to as a kind of a widespread becoming tactical of online reputation. And another thing that I think is very interesting is that this is something that kind of blurs the distinction between, let's say, very clearly militarized examples, such as an actual sort of cyber warfare operation linked to a particular military, or indeed to a particular troll factory, etc. But also in a smaller way, it's not only that, in a way, because there are probably all online users, at least to a small extent, have some place in manipulating the distribution of reputation capital. And that's kind of by design, by the performativity of the measures, by the fact that liking a particular thing, of course, is often aimed at getting something to appear on a news feed, or maybe trend, or maybe even go viral. So there's a kind of a persistent appeal to that, which might be which might be present. This kind of sense of becoming tactical might be present in something as simple and straightforward as liking a friend's post, which has even that has probably a little tiny bit of a sort of tactical dimension, right up to a major sort of military operation that's really thinking about tracking signs of likability.
Yeah. So just again to summarize briefly, because I assume like people are not really like a lot of new information is coming for those who don't have economic background. So essentially, the reputation capital paradigm as a user, you get more likes or whatever, more followers over time. Reputation volatility paradigm is it's not guaranteed. You can get bashed and then you're gonna lose your reputation capital or like banned from the platform, or so there's this kind of like switch from like kind of gradual growth or stability to this like volatility essentially. So warfare comes as a strategic response to get advantage from the
Yes.
and so what I wanted to ask you next is so we can like think about warfare more in the reputation paradigm, and so there must be, if it's a warfare, there must be defensive and offensive ways of performing reputation warfare. So in my project, which was building on your work essentially, Circuits of Truth, that is the part of this exhibition, I look into verification marks, the blue ticks, as an instance of such defensive reputation warfare. So I analyze how blue ticks save the most profitable users for the platform, which are influencers and micro influencers, from this like instability or like bashing. So verification marks solidify the gained reputation of a user and allow them to be subject to the like kind of previous reputation capital paradigm, be protected from this like online bashing. So I wanted to ask you, what are other like examples of offensive reputation warfare you might know, and maybe like another like interesting thing would be to think about the difference between like offensive and defensive mode of reputation warfighting.
That's really, really interesting. And I think first of all, I think that's you gave a really sort of very nice summary of my again extremely long-winded answer.
No, sorry, it's very simplistic. It's important to have a in-depth.
No, it's great. And I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I'm interested in the fact that that there are strategic actors, and I talk a little bit about Steve Bannon as the Trump 2016 election campaign late arriving campaign strategist who was sort of very much a kind of thinking of reputational volatility, in this case of Hillary Clinton's, for example, as something that could be kind of capitalized on. And I was sort of thinking about his sort of orchestration of reputation volatility from that was very much at arm's length from the campaign, kind of quite outsourced. So through sort of online troll armies and kind of gotten interested in politics through his news outlet Breitbart, that it was almost like he was purchasing an option on reputation and volatility, saying, right, we can claim that for the campaign at a later date if expedient for us at the time, but if not, then we can say, oh, that's not us. That wasn't us who did that. So it's I think it's kind of these really complex forms of orchestrating public opinion that I'm interested in, and that seem to me to be maybe at their most successful and effective sometimes when they are thinking of volatility itself as something to be intervened in, so something that can be valuable, right? Because of course volatility is an incredibly can be a very, very unequalizing force, if you like. For example, let's say there's a huge stock market crash, right? That might be have incredibly violent consequences for many people who might lose their homes because their mortgages default, for instance. They might lose their job because the market is bad and jobs are being lost. And yet there might be a few strategic actors who can really capitalize very effectively on that volatility, and who might, for instance, have shorted a particular asset that's about to go down. In other words, to kind of bet against the asset to make money if a particular, let's say, stock goes down rather than if it goes up. So there are ways in which there are probably volatility makes things really it can make things really awful for a lot of people, but also there are a few people who can really capitalize on it, and so that makes it a very unequal medium. And I think this is something that's really interesting, and I was really interested in your exhibition in the way that you had a really interesting diagram about that sort of shows a kind of a sort of feedback loop, if you like, between reputation offense and reputation defense. And I was really interested in that because I actually hadn't used the term defense or offense in my book, but I was certainly very interested in the fact that you used it, and interested in how you kind of took those ideas and to a different place than I had. I suppose in some ways, I hadn't used those terms in part because of a slight feeling that they sort of they have a kind of very binary connotation, I suppose, of sort of action and reaction, offense and defense. And I think it's true, it's certainly true, that there are instances of that where, for example, there might be an offensive where someone attacks a particular reputation. Then the attacked person might defend themselves in a particular way. So there are certainly examples of a very sort of binary sort of offense-defense mechanism. But at least in my view, and this is something we might differ on in an interesting way. At least in my view, I would tend to think about things like the Twitter verified checkmark, for example. There's a media scholar, Alison Hearn, who writes a wonderful essay about this called Verified. And I mean, social media platforms are constantly kind of producing very different conditions for different users, different classes of users, even, if you like. So people who have the verified checkmark, that of course acts as a symbol of status for them, but it also ensures that they won't lose their rank to the same extent that other users could. I tend to think of that in terms of the term risk instead of defense exactly. And I think about quite a lot the fact that reputation on the surface can appear quite democratic, quite universally applicable, quite, as if it makes it equally possible for everyone to cultivate their reputation capital, their human capital. But in fact, it seems to me that it's more like it creates a distribution of different risk profiles for different users. So certain users have maybe almost no reputational risk on a particular platform, like a celebrity with a verified checkmark. Maybe they don't have that much risk at all. Another user might have a truly enormous amount of risk. And these things are also, they're not clearly defined either. And it's not straightforward to say that acts of, for instance, actively diminishing somebody's online reputation, even sort of shorting it in a way, like betting on its demise. It's not straightforward to say that these acts are necessarily politically regressive either. So, for example, I mean, the Me Too movement comes to mind. Now, there are all kinds of debates about the strengths and limitations of the Me Too movement. And how it related to a kind of court of public opinion, how it relates to the questions around race. But at the end of the day, I mean, there was something, this was a sort of a viral campaign using the hashtag Me Too that was sort of around or it kind of catalyzed by the problem that Harvey Weinstein, who now is sort of known as a major sex predator for many, many years, who preyed on aspiring Hollywood actresses, often among other women working in Hollywood. There was kind of no other way to bring down his reputation. And so the online platform really seemed to help with that, actually. Speaking of reputation defense, although maybe it's
Maybe
more
risk
offense.
mitigation.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because it sort of later emerged that part of the reason why the Harvey Weinstein allegations failed to come to light. I mean, in one word, you could call it power, of course, because he had quite a lot of it. But more specifically, he was threatening to make big enemies out of any newspapers who dared to publish a story against him, for example. So that, I mean, in some ways, I almost want to call that like an offensive defense. I will defend my reputation by threatening news outlets if they go against me, because they will make a very powerful enemy in the process. And of course, these are all questions of power, and there are probably relatively few people who have enough power to actually protect their reputations in that kind of way, right? But a counter to that, somehow, a kind of a mobilization of a massive sort of like kind of counter speculation against Harvey Weinstein's reputation did sort of seem to help in a way. And of course, it wasn't the only factor, because there were journalists who were working very hard to kind of break the story in the New York Times. But it entered into an assemblage with all kinds of other mechanisms, which, in my view at least, have everything to do with a kind of tipping point. A tipping point where something like a general sense shifts, where let's say news outlets, for instance, might say, my reputation will be also diminished if I go against this person's reputation, so I can't do it. To sort of, it switches, and actually will seem really behind the times if we don't also publish a story against these allegations. So there's a kind of there's this sort of very complex sort of and very, I would say, weather-like unfolding of tipping points in public opinion, which can play out in ways that are it's almost like these sorts of complexities really, for me anyway, the terms offense and defense are in there, but it's all, to me, I almost feel like it's the feedback loop between them is so fast that it almost breaks them down. And like offense is defense is offense, so like that, I don't know, that's kind of how I think about it. But
Yeah.
I mean, I'd be curious to hear more about how you think about
Yeah,
that.
no, they're actually very hard to distinguish, and I think and that's why I think the feedback loop and the risk is a very good example in that, because it's more as if you're standing in the field, and it's more your position in the field. It's not that they're two separate planes of defense and offense. It's more like how much of a power relation you have in the situation, if it makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because there's I mean there's a sort of chapter in progress in my book called Reputations at Risk, Reputation as Risk. And it's kind of thinking about the fact that I mean, there's a lot of writing on risk societies. So, for example, Ulrich Beck famously wrote about the risk society. Modern society is one that was sort of obsessed with kind of predicting and mitigating risks, but also as a sort of future-oriented disposition. But in doing that, would also produce these sort of massive systemic risks at the same time. And it's in some ways that I was definitely kind of thinking about that work, thinking about how online reputation has kind of played out and taken shape as something that, at least from certain angles in early conversations, seemed like it was about mitigating against risk. How will I be sure that I won't be ripped off by this seller or this host or whatever? But then it becomes clearer that kind of risk mitigation logic that reputation kind of is, and maybe was long before platforms, right? I mean, how do you know an employer's any good before you take a job? You might try to listen to the gossip and see what kind of reputation that employer has as a good employer. But that kind of that sort of logic of, and that sort of the becoming this sort of becoming reflexive quality of that logic of kind of risk mitigation via reputation starts to then produce more risks and more risks, and very importantly, more and more stratifications of who is at risk and who is exempted from the risk. And one of the things I'm kind of interested in, for example, in the 2016 Donald Trump election campaign, for instance, is the idea that, for instance, like in that race, it was, let's say, reputational attack was perhaps heavily foregrounded, partly because as the Cambridge Analytica analysts who were housed in the Trump campaign sort of dubbed it, the key voters were what they termed double haters. So in other words, voters who could be swing voters who really disliked both Trump and Clinton, but were highly likely to turn out and vote. So therefore, tarnishing the opponent's reputation could be a very important strategy. But also, it was interesting to me that with it, so there was a particular sort of demographic, if you like, reason why reputation trashing was so important in that election. But there was also a sense in which it seemed to me that the one part of the dynamic that I saw kind of playing out was that attempts to tarnish Hillary Clinton's reputation seemed to be quite effective because she had always been playing that game. She had been going for a good reputation as a Washington figure and a politician. Trump was never playing that game, and so it did nothing. Nothing really seemed to stick when people tried to tarnish his reputation or call him a racist or a misogynist. It didn't seem to kind of matter. And there's something, this has a lot to do with the relationships between race, gender, and reputation, for sure. And in my writing, I am trying to kind of link these terms to this kind of risk logic, because it seems very clear that that certain subjects kind of structurally bear a lot more reputational risk than others. But it also, that there's a kind of production of what I call a kind of like a reputational sovereign, almost like he, and I'm using he quite deliberately here, kind of thinking of Trump as an example, he who remains outside of reputation volatility. So the reputation volatility will be very damaging for others, but will not touch the sovereign, the exception to the rule of reputation.
Yeah, that's very interesting. The sovereign, I feel like Putin could be thought as reputation sovereign.
Yeah.
Like so many investigations were published about him, still gonna go for another 20 years
Yeah.
probably. I wanted to go now about like cyber war context more and highlight. I found it very interesting the switch that you're signifying because in more broad cyber warfare literature, I was stumbling upon the same turn that you talk about, and in particular in the book Cyberwar and Revolution by Svitlana Matvyienko and Nick Dyer-Witherford, they talk there about the militarization of cyberspace, and this is a new kind of paradigm of social networks, where social networks who have the access to very sensitive political data, as we know from Cambridge Analytica, and both to political ads, can create new unprecedented layers of polarization, influence in elections, etc., etc. So cyberspace becomes this new, very important context for the cyber conflict. And I was wondering because, like all of this economy of cyberspace published like several years ago, or like 5 years ago in particular, was published the platform economy book. So maybe the from platform capitalism, now we need to like think more about platform militarism in a
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And yeah, I mean, platform militarism, I think is yeah, there's a lot of interesting potential in that term, and it's not a term that I've used myself. Although I do talk about the weaponization of social media, and this is something that is the sort of prevalence of the even just the form of thought, the weaponization of X, is something that Will Davis talks about in his book Nervous States, for example, as part of something like a breakdown of the distinction between war and peace, which have often been seen as sort of polar opposites of one another. But something like the weaponization of everyday tools, including social media, including likes, although including all kinds of other things as well, of course. This speaks to a kind of erosion of the distinction between war and peace. And yeah, the term weaponization of social media is something that, other people have kind of done more in-depth work on, especially like kind of coming from a military background, which I personally do not. But for instance, there's a book by Singer and Brooking called Like War that goes into the weaponization of social media in a variety of ways, and they're interested in, for example, how online aggression can increase offline violence. For example, in gang wars in Chicago, let's say, or or indeed in these sort of this sort of I suppose a kind of a public relations kind of disposition that starts to sort of merge with military operations in things like the act.il app, whereby the international reputation of Israel, at least in theory, is managed, right? And there's also, by the way, some interesting scholarship around how those operations can fail, because of course it's not all of this stuff is really a gamble. It's very complex, and sometimes the kind of the becoming tactical of the space, the use of tactics can really spectacularly backfire, actually, and the very well resourced actors who might think that they're controlling the field can sometimes be really blindsided if they don't, if they kind of grate with public opinion, for example. So it's really quite complicated how this stuff plays out. Singer and Brooking are partly picking up on the military tome on war from Karl von Clausewitz, published in 1832, just sort of like a massive, somewhat rambling book. But one of the things that they sort of pick up on is particularly von Clausewitz very, for the time, very novel decision not to see war as the complete interruption of politics and business as usual, as was often done prior to that book. Instead, he was thinking about the fact that war is simply a continuation of politics by other means. And what is politics? Well, it's getting what one wants. So there's a kind of this sense of sort of a lack of clear distinction between war and politics that that they're really picking up on when they think about how social media is being weaponized, and again how this idea of the tools that social media purports to offer can very easily become weapons. So I think that sort of idea of weaponization is, I think, really interesting. Maybe one last thing to say about the like there are a lot of terms that are associated with cyber war, and I don't use the term cyber war in my book because I suppose it's not because what I'm terming reputation warfare isn't relevant for cyber war, which I think it definitely is. And certainly I think some of your research really clearly shows that. But it's maybe that there are a lot of aspects of cyber war that are not sort of relevant to what I'm describing as reputation. So, server hacks. I have one, I think I've just one server hack in my book to do with ClimateGate, but it's really used in a kind of very precise context because it was absolutely targeting professional reputations. So that's sort of why I don't use that term myself. Although there are so many ways in which what I'm talking about really does link with cyber warfare. And there are other terms like information war, for example, propaganda, which come up a lot in these discussions. And of course, in what is sometimes termed a post-truth moment, I use that term myself sometimes, although with a little bit of caution, because I'm not fond of the sort of connotation that as if there was some kind of like erstwhile like truthier past or something like that, which doesn't seem accurate at all, does it? But there's the idea of the manipulation of information and the micro-targeting of voters, for example, as in the Cambridge Analytica scandal, are very important. On the other hand, I would say there are very important kind of caveats in this field. So scholars like Yochai Benkler, I think, are doing some really interesting work on sort of, for example, making sure that the Cambridge Analytica for the impact of Cambridge Analytica on, let's say, the 2016 Trump election, for instance, is not overstated to at the expense of a clear and kind of more nuanced interpretation of sort of what's going on in the field. It's very easy to identify behind the scenes sort of boogeymans, if you like, or just go like, oh no, they're manipulating us. And it's true to an extent, but one of the things that Benkler argues is that it's not immediately clear that Cambridge Analytica's PSYOP operations were necessarily all that much more effective than previous attempts to persuade and even manipulate voters. So it's kind of, these things certainly do represent clear long-term threats to democracy. But at the same time, when we analyze them, it's very important to be thinking about what they haven't accomplished, as opposed to construing them as these like magical, all-powerful, all-knowing things that can totally succeed all the time at knowing exactly how to get every single voter to go their way, right? Because they're not. Sometimes they fail, sometimes they work really well. Maybe I think a lot of what I'm talking about on online platforms actually kind of emerges partly by accident, really. It's, the dynamics are so complex when thinking about the emergence of what I call reputational weather online. The patterns are so complicated that no evil mastermind or platform designer really could have anticipated things in advance, I think. So there are a lot of unintended consequences. But also, I suppose one of the things I really wanted to do is to offer sort of a corollary, I suppose, to the framing of information war and to the very prevalent sort of foregrounding of kind of informational manipulations that are very important to all kinds of regimes, propaganda campaigns around the world, and things. Um, and and in a way, for me, reputation warfare is a kind of parallel and related but distinct sort of set of operations to something like information warfare or online propaganda, for instance. And one of the things that I take from Gloria Origi's work on reputation is the idea that reputation is kind of has an epistemological orientation. In other words, it's a sort of social epistemological tool. So it helps people make judgments about things even when they're not necessarily expert on those things. So for instance, if somebody's choosing which doctor to go to, let's say, they probably don't have the specialized knowledge to know exactly which doctor is the best. But they might read the reviews or ask a friend for a recommendation, and that will help to sort of make a choice that they're happy with. And one of the things that Gloria Origi argues is that when there's a massive glut of information available, it becomes harder and harder to ascertain the quality of that information. And therefore, reputation becomes more important and more sort of foregrounded as a shorthand, as an epistemological tool for trying to work out what is credible and what isn't. So, for example, if I'm looking at an online article, I might really be thinking about the reputation of the publisher of that article to determine how, like, as a kind of way of prejudging the content. And so I'm interested in how ideas like information warfare or even post-truth or propaganda kind of focus on the sort of content side of things. But there's also this kind of this reputational aspect that is kind of linked to the problem of evaluating information, and certainly, as we know, in many online platforms, it's incredibly contradictory, incredibly filtered, and indeed sometimes very weaponized information that is being meted out. But the role of reputation judgments in that is sort of distinct, related, very linked to it, but something else, I would say.
I wanted to ask actually if anyone would have any questions, you can ask them online, and I'll maybe ask Bahar to read them. But for now, can you make the thing in focus? Okay, sorry, it's okay. Yeah, we're a bit blurred. Yeah, I wanted to ask the last question for now while we're gathering questions, if there are going to be any. In your work, you talk a lot about like automation and algorithmic ratings, and there's also another trend in cyber warfare which talks about the use of algorithmic tools or automation to optimize the cyber warfare. Bots would be the most known example, as like fully automated parts of the like commenter doing comments or putting likes. But there are also other modes, actors, sorry, who are called cyborgs, which is essentially the human operator augmented by the set of scripts or trolls, or would be using other modes of automation. So I was wondering how this kind of like automation and reputation, or like automation in making the reputation more volatile, and this kind of automation in the cyber warfare, how like what would be the final result, or like would they affect each other and like exacerbate each other effects? And with that, I was thinking about like the birth of high frequency trading,
Uh-huh.
and I think it's going to be interesting to think about like how high frequency trading was like getting in our real life, and like what might happen next with this kind of markets.
Interesting. Really, really interesting question. And definitely the fact that there's an automated sort of whole layer, or I think probably it's better to say many layers of online reputation is really significant. And it's also interesting. I mean, in my book, I kind of said that online platforms inaugurate sort of accidental, partly accidental, vast distributed reputational markets. And that kind of reorient what a sort of public sphere or public discourse could kind of look like, because of this sort of prevalence of a vast distributed reputational market. And there's an interesting, I mean, you mentioned high frequency trading, and I think there's a really interesting example. It's not what I'm focused on, but there's another recent book that's come out by an author called Tim Hwang, and it's a book called Subprime Attention Crisis. It's quite interesting. He's talking about the construction of the online advertising auction system, which is, of course, it's designed, of course, to allow all kinds of platforms to have revenue by displaying advertisements. And it actually was set up by ex like high frequency trading people, which I did not know before reading his book. But so it was the online. It's basically a real time auction system that's very similar to how high frequency trading goes down. So every time a user will load a page, there will be a real time automated high frequency auction to get that particular ad spot on that page. And so there's a direct link there with high frequency trading and how attention in Huang's analysis is being packaged and understood as a kind of derivative form. So his argument essentially is that there's going to be, he contends, a subprime attention crisis because the value, like basically what is this high frequency online ad auction market actually selling? Well, it's selling users' attention, of course. But it's not selling that attention directly. It's selling a derivative form of the attention. In other words, a particular measure of how you're going to get your ad on a page in front of some eyeballs. But it's so there's a kind of derivative form, but actually the value of the underlying asset, Huang argues, has gone down considerably. Like people just don't like there's huge generational differences, for example, in how much people actually bother to look at the ads when they like younger generations like barely even register them at all. So there's almost no value in a way to this underlying asset anymore of attention, but it's still being traded on this derivatives, kind of market for attention, which Huang argues will kind of go subprime and then create a huge problem in how platforms are supposed to generate revenue anymore. So that's kind of that's a kind of parallel but very intriguing example, I think, in terms of how there's a kind of derivative market for online attention, if you like. With online reputation, it's what's really interesting to me actually is that I do talk about automation in my book, but it's actually there are scholars who go way deeper than I do in that direction. What I'm talking about really is not so much, for example, platform algorithms themselves, insofar as one can study them, given that they're proprietary. But it's not so much trying to think about the algorithms themselves as a kind of a kind of meeting point between these sort of automated mechanisms which will sort of amplify or fail to amplify different reputational signals. But what I would say is actually, like, at the heart of it, my interest is actually in the kind of the very sort of user focused, usually, not always, but usually kind of user focused act of clicking on stuff and liking stuff and friending and all of that. Um, and thinking about the accidental vast distributed reputational market as something that inaugurates what I call crowdsourced credibility. In other words, there's like the fundamental sort of pretense is that you can kind of, it's a crowdsourced operation, and you can say, right, by liking this, I'm contributing to the accruing reputation of this particular YouTuber or whatever. And so it's kind of, but what I think is quite interesting is that act of sort of participating in crowdsourced credibility, right? And of course, it's not always human users doing that. As we know, there are bots that routinely amplify politicians' tweets, for example, to make them look more popular, of course, which is also a tactic that can backfire too, because it can look a bit desperate, shoddy, fake, all of these sorts of things. So it's, again, like how effective these things actually are is not straightforward at all, is it? But so it's not always an act of a human user, but in many cases it is, and there's certainly an appeal to the human user to be part of this sort of crowdsourced credibility, to kind of conflate voting and liking in a certain way. But at the same time, the something like the like button, for example, part of its job is to generate data for a platform such as Facebook. So where there might previously have been no data about what people actually like that they see on a page, now there is some data, and then that can be then kind of used, analyzed, mobilized in all kinds of different ways. And I think there's a kind of funny, I would say almost sort of retroactive or slightly residual quality to like the Facebook like as a data point in a way, because my sense is that the like is, I mean, it's still important data for Facebook, but at the same time, the data that they use keep getting more and more detailed, more and more nuanced. For example, content, video completion rates for like how much of a particular video someone will watch from their news feed before they just let it scroll by. So they're kind of more and more minute data kind of going in all the time, and maybe constantly changing just how important the like is itself as a data point. But one of the things that I'm very interested in is that platform algorithms, for example, will quite often increase inequalities between different levels of popularity of a particular post or video, for example, and indeed in different users as well. And this is something that I talk about thinking about YouTubers and the sort of problem of trying to make it on YouTube for those who try that, and particularly in a kind of marketplace on YouTube, like an attention marketplace that's expanding at an extraordinary rate, so that what one had to do to become a YouTube star like several, 6 years ago or something, is probably way less than what it would take to achieve that level of attention now, because there's so many people trying it out that the kind of the possibility for grabbing attention is a lot weaker. But equally, I'm kind of arguing that there's this sort of there's this interesting kind of phenomenon that a lot of YouTubers will talk about, where they'll say that they are really beholden, if they're trying to actually monetize their platform, they're really beholden to the algorithm, quote unquote, the algorithm. Of course, there's not one single platform algorithm, but still the idea of the algorithm as a kind of like almost a kind of imagined entity of what the platform seems to want. It becomes very palpable, it seems, for some YouTubers in terms of how they're thinking about what they post. And there are indeed YouTubers who talk about how they will change the content that they're posting and the frequency with which they're posting in order to curry favor with the platform algorithms, which of course are, in some sense, it might be all about trending, all about getting into that recommended videos stream. Otherwise, you may never ever reach a monetization threshold or get much of an audience. And so I kind of argue that this is there's I call them status moods. I'm kind of interested in how automation. I'm not sort of deeply analyzing automation, at least in this book, in and of itself, but I'm trying to think about how automation exacerbates sort of status inequalities, and then how that sort of um, funnels back into kind of the moods of how people understand what status even is, and what might be interesting or important about it. So if in grammar, like a grammatical mood expresses like the attitude of the speaker towards what is spoken about. So I'm thinking about the status mood as like the kind of the implied sort of attitude of the person seeking the status towards status itself. And so I argue that there's kind of like a meritocratic mode of status, of like just an idea that based on merit, which is of course a very contested concept right now. Generally, there's a lot of debates on meritocracy. But there's an idea that merit will beget reputation, will beget status. There's an idea, and that exists on platforms. So, for example, I don't know if somebody's looking up David Bowie videos on YouTube. Certainly, his status as a musician doesn't depend on what's on YouTube at all. Then there's maybe a kind of cultivative mood that's about a kind of a giving of oneself, as like I give you my platform, my YouTube channel. Here's all my free yoga classes that I'm offering to you for free. If you'll just please like and share this channel and subscribe and all of that. So kind of a cultivation of a community through one's online status as a kind of gift. And of course, there's a lot of historical debates on online gift economies and the problem of the gift. Tiziana Terranova's work touches on that, certainly. And then something that I call an assetized mood, or even a lottery landslide mood, which is very much this sort of reflexive mood of like, I've got to appeal to what the algorithm will pick up, or I will tweak the content of what I post until I find that exact sort of logic of what will get picked up, right? And so it's sort of so I'm kind of very interested in these subtle interactions of between an appeal to kind of mostly human crowdsourced credibility, and then this sort of automated amplification or indeed sort of dampening of the signals based on what the platform kind of thinks might be more marketable and more garnering of attention. So yet another very long-winded answer.
It's the interview, of course. Thank you very much. Do you have any questions? Uh, what's the time now? Because I feel it's been 1 hour and a half. Maybe we just wrap up, if you don't mind. Okay, okay. Amazing. Thank you very much for the amazing conversation, and thank you for staying and listening to us for such a long time. And yeah, please join tomorrow for the workshop with Jared Davis. Gonna be along the same lines on the particularities of platform economy. Thank you for staying. Bye.
Thank you.